G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our webinar series, Australia's Biggest Book Club for May. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Australia's Biggest Book Club is on at least once a month, but the days and times do vary for our webinars. So please head on over to australiainstitute.org.au for details of all our upcoming events. The next episode of Australia's Biggest Book Club for June, we'll be speaking with Joelle Gergis, the author of the next quarterly essay, which is titled Highway to Hell, Climate Change and Australia's Future from Black Ink. And just a few tips for Zoom before we kick off. If you hover over the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a Q&A box where you can type in questions for Bri and upvote other people's questions and make comments as well. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we'll boot you out. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and it will go up on our website and on our YouTube channel after this. So Bri Lee is the multi-award winning author of Eggshell Skull. And we last spoke to her about her book, Who Gets to Be Smart? And a few of you might remember that amazing book as well. Her journalism, essays, and short stories have been published widely, and she's the creator and editor of News and Reviews. And The Work is her debut novel and our feature book for May. The Work is about the biggest intersections of life, of art and commerce, of intimacy and distance, of talent and entitlement, and of labour and privilege. And in The Work, we meet Lally, owner of her own art gallery in Manhattan, who's really starting to see some of the sacrifices that she has made start to pay off, and Pat, who's a scholarship boy desperate to establish himself in Sydney's antiquities scene. Pat and Lally meet at New York's Armory show and their chemistry is instant. This is a love story and so much more. And I just want to welcome you and thank you for coming along, Bri Lee. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hi, Ebony. Lovely to see you again. Thank you for following me on the journey from nonfiction to fiction.
No, absolutely. It's been a pleasure. So this is what the novel looks like for anyone who hasn't yet picked up your copy. It's in all good bookstores everywhere. I know you've been on a tour to promote the book. Congratulations. I really enjoyed it. And I imagine it must be a lovely feeling having finished your first fiction novel.
Thank you. Yeah, it's been a huge tour. And the book took about 5 years to write in total. Yeah. So yeah, it is a relief. And I did feel a lot of pressure. I mean, there's always pressure with a book. It's such a major work. But I felt a lot of pressure this time because, there are a lot of people wondering, like, sort of who does she think she is or can she do it? And now it's done. So
now it's done.
Yeah.
So I just want to start at the beginning, I guess. The novel opens with Lally in the midst of a sexual encounter with an artist. It really sets the scene well. But of all the ways that you could introduce us to one of your main protagonists, I guess I wanted to ask, why did you decide to start her story there?
Well, I think, ultimately, almost every decision I made about my book as a writer was just informed by what I like reading, and my life as a reader. I have always said, and I still believe, that the most important job of a writer is to read, and to read widely, and to read a lot. And I don't like what Helen Garner would refer to as bullshit preambles. I don't want to be kind of led around a subject matter and given this like rambling kind of establishing thing before I find out what's important to someone and who I'm supposed to care about and how high the stakes are going to be. So in Lally's opening scene in particular, there was a huge amount that I wanted to communicate. I mean, it is chapter 1, but it's quite short. And in this chapter, I mean, it's chapter 1, so I'll just say what happens. I don't think you can say it's a spoiler if it happens in chapter 1. Lally is having sex with one of the artists who she has, in her gallery. A classic sort of, it's easy to sort of wag your finger at people who mix business and pleasure and then it goes wrong. But what we learn, because it's very, very close third person, is that she's not just, fucking this guy. She has started to develop serious feelings for him. And then while they're having sex, she realizes in a kind of quite terrifying moment that he's been filming her without her consent. And when she confronts him, he just sort of, minimizes, gaslights, and she kicks him out of her apartment. And it's a very devastating moment for her as an instance of both like personal betrayal and then the kind of professional ramifications for how it could sort of tank her or ruin her professional reputation in life if this gets out, if this goes wrong. And what I wanted to show was that this is a woman who is and has reason to be like kind of afraid of falling in love or afraid of having a relationship, because that could have terrible ramifications for her. But also there's a way in which in the conversations that happen both before and after the sex, you realize that Lally has quite a lot of power over this artist because of her role as the gallerist. And then ultimately, though, when they're having sex, he has power over her because of the simple fact that this is heterosexual sex and he's a man. And so that opening scene, what I wanted it to do was, within a lot of like page turner kind of sexy and then terrible like action happening, it kind of lays this very like multi-layered sort of strata almost of how many nuances there are to the kind of give and take in both personal and professional relationships, which then continues through the novel.
Yeah, and obviously it's something that you explore with her character throughout the book, though. I guess the agency that she has as the owner of a gallery with a lot of power over artists' lives and some of the trade-offs and decisions that she makes with that. But before we get into some of that, I did want to ask about Pat, who by comparison feels or felt to me a little bit like a naive character almost. He's obviously, at least compared to Lally, he's obviously on the make and, he's trying to reach his way to the top, but the way you've written him, he seems a lot younger to me and inexperienced. And he also has that dynamic of clearly feeling like an outsider and very clearly coming from a background that could not be further from the Sydney arts and antiquities scene. So how important was that contrast to you, or is that just kind of the way Pat emerged in your head?
A bit of both. The contrast was very deliberate in terms of, for example, their slight age gap and being in the direction that it was. So Pat is in his late 20s, I would say like 28. Lally is in her early 30s, I'd say like 32, I guess. I just imagine there's about a 5-year age gap. But when I was at the very, very early stages of thinking about the issues I wanted to explore in this book, and what I was reading at the time was just so much contemporary fiction in which there is an age gap relationship, even like from 5 years to sort of like 15, 20, 30 years. And it's just almost always an older man, either older a little bit or older a lot. And when I was just, frankly, as a reader, again, just as a reader, I was really tired of that. There's already a kind of power dynamic that exists in heterosexual relationships, both in terms of like, honestly, like the capital that people will bring to different relationships because of the wage gap, but also this kind of power dynamic. And when I thought to myself, well, what would happen if these two protagonists, if the man was in his late 20s and the woman was in her early 30s, everything changed. It was like the novel cracked open in a really exciting way. And it's so true what you said, that Pat seems very naive. There is a way in which I think a lot, obviously this is a sweeping generalization, but there's a way in which like Pat is like a lot of young Australian men. He sort of has, life hasn't been totally smooth sailing and easy for him, but there are like so many challenges that he has just never had to and will never have to face. And it means he's sort of enjoyed almost an extended adolescence. And he, he doesn't have the money, he doesn't have the capital to sort of keep up with the arts and antiquities scene in Sydney, but he also, when he goes home, doesn't feel like he fits in there. And in particular, I think Pat's part of the book is a real sort of coming of age story. Lally knows who she is and knows she's making mistakes but is very ambitious and has particular goals. Pat is still very much figuring things out.
Yeah. I want to come back to those family dynamics because I was really interested in those elements. But I guess I wanted to ask how much you knew about this world before starting the novel, because obviously this is really specifically in the art scene and a lot of it very specifically in the New York art scene. But neither of your main protagonists are really artists themselves. So what interested you about setting them in the commercial aspects of the art world? And yeah, how much did you know about this world before you embarked on the novel?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked this question, Ebony. I knew from the outset that I wanted the book to be set in a creative industry, but that neither of the major characters were themselves artists. Because what I wanted to look at was what I was one of the two big questions I think this book asks is like sort of how does money and capital affect love, and then how does money and capital affect art? And I wanted neither of the main characters to be artists themselves because I wanted them to have these other jobs that are often deliberately invisibilized, that are part of how the kind of sausage gets made, how the creative industries really function. You know, you hear an album in your ears, or you see a visual art on the wall, or you pick up a book, and you think of that as being a product of the creative, the product of the artist, whatever medium they work in. But there are all of these other people, these dealers and publicists and managers and the people involved in the kind of muddy, murky sort of commercial business side of things that have a huge impact on how the creative work is ultimately kind of shaped and perceived and received and priced. And I wanted very much for the whole, or for the vast majority of the kind of book to take place in that part that often we deliberately kind of keep behind the curtain.
Yeah.
And then in terms of the research, one of the reasons I chose to set it in the visual art world is because my mother was, when I was growing up, and still is, a very talented visual artist, but she never had the opportunity to sort of professionalize that. And so I grew up where she ran a visual art supplies shop, and I grew up, taking days off school and standing on an upside down milk crate at the cash register, putting people's pastels and oil paint through. But my knowledge of art, visual art in particular, was at a real sort of individual kind of just creative, passionate level. None of this commercial, none of this sort of white wall, none of the, not even fair, nowhere near fairs or anything. And so that, and certainly not in the kind of Pat's arena, which is more antiquities and like dealers and old art. That was all research from scratch. Yeah.
That's really interesting because, yeah, one of the things that struck me, obviously, this is a love story and I love those elements of it. But gallery owner in particular is just such a, like, that's a rom-com job, right? But you never really see any of the mechanics of it. It's just normally a function to put them in a cool kind of a scene and establish them as a cool character. So I was really kind of fascinated by some of those dilemmas that you explore with Lali's character and how the decisions that the commercial decisions that she is making as the owner of that gallery establish not just her agency, but some real kind of moral and financial dilemmas for her. There's that trade-off between making sure that the gallery is a commercial enough prospect that she can support emerging artists. And there's a lot of conflict internally for her in terms of wanting to spot and encourage talent, maybe from diverse backgrounds, but then knowing that she can't do that without having commercial success. And that involves some really clear and sometimes disturbing trade-offs for her. How much was that really the guts of what you wanted to get to with this novel? Because that a lot of those elements were the things that I enjoyed most about the novel. Was that also the thing that appealed to you the most as an author?
Yeah, definitely. And I think this is also basically the answer of why this book is fiction and not nonfiction. I think in nonfiction in general, and in particular, if somebody picks up a Bri Lee nonfiction, they're expecting to receive a kind of thesis statement or, a lot of research that builds towards an argument or a personal perspective combined with analysis, whatever it is, to to make an argument or make a case or give an answer or a complaint or a way forward. And by asking questions about how like money and art kind of influence each other and infect each other and benefit each other, that and how we're living in this time for amazingly better and sometimes unfortunately worse. People can trade on their identity and trade on their personhood and self in a way like the internet has enabled that in a way that no other time has seen, and that leads to essentially like Lally's entire professional trajectory sits in this really murky gray zone where she's just constantly having to balance kind of competing interests. And there are some things that, and she's also ambitious, which is really, really a good thing to a certain point, and then it goes too far and becomes a bad thing and compromises on her integrity. But where that line is really murky. And I didn't have it's not even that I didn't have I was not interested in trying to come up with a concrete answer to these questions. Like, this is an ethical, moral fucking swamp, and I wanted to force the reader to sit in that and make their own judgments and come to their own conclusions rather than waiting for like the authorial line that tells them what to think and how to feel. And not only did that make, like, fiction is perfect for that. Fiction is perfect for making a character who feels very real, putting them in a situation that feels very real, and then dialing it up to 11 so that they are forced into situations that make the reader also stop and think. And how Lally is grappling with both cultural capital and actual capital. She has these programs that platform marginalized voices and goes out of her way and sort of makes a financial loss in a way from doing that. But having done that over the last few years, she's now sitting on this gold mine of sort of cultural capital that she very much trades in, and also accumulating an art collection that increases in value every year. And sort of there are infinite gives and takes and infinite sort of pulls in different directions. And it gets her into a lot of trouble.
Yeah, and many would say deserved trouble and, really, I mean, I guess faces the consequences of making some of those tough decisions. But I'm really interested in, obviously, Lally has a very different experience and is able to set up her gallery because of her financial situation in particular, which you go into a little. But Pat very clearly, went to a fancy school on a scholarship, is kind of from regional Queensland, and as you said, lacks capital. He's kind of at the very beginning of his career trying to crack through, but he hasn't made it yet. So there's this element of, his family has really invested in him and backed him. He's the only one of his family who's kind of made it out of this regional town. And even though he's got kind of the networks from those connections at his kind of fancy private school, he still is excluded and can't participate in a lot of elements of that world, still very much an outsider. Those elements I found really interesting, and it reminded me actually a lot of Who Gets to Be Smart and some of those themes that you explored in that book of, just how much money determines the experiences and access that you get, not only as part of your education, but then I guess what flows on from that as well. So I guess I wanted to ask about Pat, but I also wanted to ask how much of writing that nonfiction work influenced Pat's background in this novel.
Yeah, a lot. I think also because of the timing, I started thinking about the themes that I wanted to explore in the fiction and these big questions, and realized that it would have to be fiction in late 2018. And I started seriously writing this novel in early 2019 when I went over to New York for 5 or 6 weeks. And I was working on the novel a lot consistently through that year. And then obviously in early 2020, COVID hit and lockdown happened. And there were a lot of authors who were working on contemporary fiction stories who all of a sudden had to decide whether or not they would set the book either specifically before lockdowns, during lockdowns, or if they would take a very bold punt on, you know, what post-lockdown might look like. And so I had to put the novel on ice. And it was also in that year of 2020 where the questions I had started asking for Who Gets to Be Smart had their answers blown up and revealed a new Black Lives Matter hitting the mainstream that year, and the way the Morrison government was responding to that, and the kind of pushback and the like university fee restructuring, and the huge gap that was emerging between public and private schools in how they grappled with lockdowns. Just all of these things. There were so many reasons why the novel, had to be like sort of put on ice a bit. But Who Gets to Be Smart, it was time to dial that up. And I think obviously those two works, although they have completely different kind of creative outcomes, were clearly sort of cross-pollinating.
Because yeah, I imagine it is there is that phenomenon across many Western countries in particular, I guess, of where you have to come from a wealthy background to be able to afford to be a starving artist. But I like that this kind of explored that carries over into the rest of the industry as well, the commercial sides of things.
That was just briefly on that. That was something I knew I wanted to explore as well, because frustration I have with a lot of the creative industries and a lot of the kind of rhetoric and media coverage, or just the way people talk about creatives in Australia in particular, I think is really unhelpful and unhealthy, because we sort of have this sort of, I don't know if it's some kind of tall poppy or whatever, but if you try and like make money from your art, you're a sellout, and you're like think too much of yourself or whatever. But when we sort of still, so many of us perpetuate this like starving artist mythology and this like fetishization of like artistic struggling being rightful if it is completely divorced from sort of financial realities. But the only people that benefits are people with secret trust funds, because everybody else actually has to make rent and has to pay their mortgage. And in my opinion, as a creative, the absolute dream is artistic independence. And I think some version of that is what a lot of creatives would love, is just the freedom and ability to make whatever art you want to make next, right? Like that's, most creatives would say some version of that is like the ultimate. And yet you cannot have artistic independence without having some degree of financial independence. And that means you want to make your artistic work and your craft sustainable. And yet you sort of get demonized if you try to act or work in a way that will make your creative practice sustainable. And it just, at the end of the day, it means that anyone who doesn't enter this industry, any of these creative industries, anyone who doesn't enter essentially with financial or some kind of other family sort of, or some kind of other financial backing, just gets wedged out at the kind of critical mid-career section. And I think our creative industries are the poorer for it.
And then for Pat, that also causes problems for him in that kind of feels a lot of distance from his family. And we haven't talked about too much between the difference between the settings of the novel in New York and Sydney. But can I just say, some of the passages that I enjoyed the most were the contrast between Pat starting out in Sydney and heading back to Queensland. There was one passage in particular where you talked about, I found this such a joy to read. The t-shirts and thongs per capita went up along with the humidity and the UV rating. The sense of urgency and efficiency went down and friendliness went up. I think that's a pretty good summary of the difference between Sydney and probably regional Queensland. But he really struggles at fitting in with his family, and it's clearly a source of tension internally within the family. He's got kind of some siblings that have stayed in that area and are very happy with their life choices, others who aren't necessarily, but there's also a bit of a palpable sense of resentment, I think, from both Pat and the family that, he's embarked upon this kind of new direction in life that's very unfamiliar and inaccessible to them, and it really makes it difficult for him to go home. What interested you about that dynamic?
I'm just so something I am endlessly fascinated by in Australia in particular is like, I mean, I think it's fair to say that class is a kind of through line through a lot of my work. But what I am fascinated by in Australia in particular, and America has this in a similar way too, which is the way in which the class divide often also is a geographic divide in Australia. That there is just such a huge difference in life trajectories, and this is not to say one is better or worse. If you grow up in a major metropolitan area, in particular on the East Coast, versus if you live regional. And with Pat and his family, there is a huge gap between whether, like, almost like what narrative they subscribe to about whether one is better than the other. Pat feels like he was kind of, it's like this baby bird thing. Pat feels like he was booted out of the nest too early and just kind of shipped off to boarding school, where he really struggled. Whereas the rest of the family have this sense that he kind of flew away from the nest as soon as he could, and that now he looks down on them. There is a way in which Pat has really drunk the Kool-Aid of that kind of upward mobility private school rhetoric. But also, how could he not? Because he's isolated from his family and his other influences and has spent all of his high school years at a private school. And also, in particular, he has a sister, Beck. When we meet Beck, she is in a not strong financial situation, a not strong like familial situation, and has no clear it's not even about being rich. Like she lacks like basic financial security. And the thing that keeps a person like Beck in real life in Australia, the thing that keeps her from being frankly like at risk of rough sleeping or homelessness, is that her parents are like, you know, she has one kid. We find out quite early on that she's pregnant with a second. They're to different fathers. Neither of them are around. She's not got a stable job. She's renting in a bit of a shitbox. But like that, the only reason Beck's situation is not frankly like immediately of concern is because she lives close to her parents. And Pat comes home and sees things like this and wonders why his sister does not, you know, hope and dream for more. To which, of course, his sister is likely to reply, fuck you. So like, I wanted it to, again, this is fiction. This is what fiction can do so well. Like, you can see quite clearly why both of these people think the way they do and act the way they do. And it's not about either being completely right or completely wrong. It's about two siblings who, through one kind of twist of fate relatively early on, are now in completely different life situations.
Mm. I want to take us back to New York. Oh, and before I do that, I'll just remind everyone we're going to go to questions from the audience soon. So a reminder that you can type in questions for Bri in the Q&A box there. And first of all, I want to ask you, did you travel to New York to do research? And I must confess, I don't know if this is the Armory, is that like a real art show that happens? I have no idea.
Love this. Yes. So I went to New York for the third time in 2019, and I was there for like 5 or 6 weeks by myself, specifically to research what would end up becoming the work. And the Armory Art Fair is a real thing. It was on while I was there. I didn't time my New York trip to see that particular fair. I realized it was on once I was there, and I went over, and it was like so ridiculous and so crazy and extreme. Like as a writer, either from like the investigative journalism I do, or in the nonfiction or in the fiction, like whatever it is, I'm constantly looking for what I call pressure cooker environments, real situations, and they can be an instant, like a conversation between two people that for some reason is a pressure cooker, or an entire industry, or a location, or an occurrence like the Armory Fair, where this is a believable, real thing, but that everything that happens is like dialed up to 11. There's just so much stress and so much pressure and a lot of characters and a lot of stakes. The stakes are higher, right? Like that's a storytelling requisite, is a sense of stakes. And art fairs in general are pretty crazy. They are the sort of extreme, one of the extremes of functions of the modern art world, and involve a huge amount of the sort of commercial side of the art world in particular. A lot of art is actually bought and sold rather than artists making or creativity. It's the commercial side of things. And it attracts a whole lot of characters. So I just went a couple of days in a row and dressed rather boringly and sat there and eavesdropped, and people watched, and it was a gold mine of material.
I can only imagine. And New York kind of is just such a strong place setting. And from a lot of pop culture, people already have kind of a virtual experience of it. And did you do the converse in Sydney, where, the Australia section is based, and the art scene there, some elements were clearly connected to Pat's networks from school, but there's also kind of the exploration of the eastern suburbs kind of culture and aesthetic of Sydney as well. But it's still automatically just got this really different vibe from New York. Yeah. What interested you about that contrast and making the novel set in those two different places?
Well, yeah, in my head, there are three settings. There's like the Esk regional Queensland, and then there's this very inner city Sydney, and then there's New York City. And it was a huge part of Pat's story, was this kind of split identity and his feelings like he's failing, both where he came from and like where he's based now. And as I mentioned, I'm fascinated by this metropolitan regional distinction in Australia, so I knew I wanted that Australian character to have that split between those two places, and to really highlight the differences between them. And then, well, one of the other reasons I split it between Australia and America, like at all, was because I wanted the two characters to be sort of either coming together or coming apart, like whatever they're, what we would now call a situationship, to take place in part via distance. Because something else that, once you've read it, I think you can see there are so many different ways in which this book explores image making, which sounds kind of boring, but I think is huge and really charged. Like we are, especially for the kind of millennial generation, we now form so many different types of relationships, both personal and professional, through taking photos and videos of ourselves and taking photos and videos of other people. And I wanted to explore, these are two individuals, Pat and Lally, who work in very different versions of the arts industry. They know about things like, framing and composition even, and agency in image making. And I just wanted the two characters to be on different sides of the planet, so that there was this kind of personal way in which they had to navigate the agency or lack thereof of presenting themselves and framing themselves and communicating through this like kind of digital medium in a personal way, as well as the fact that happens in their professional lives a lot too.
Yeah. And it's such a modern phenomenon. Things like, I'm pretty sure it was Lally. Well, just hoping that how someone comes across in text and apps and messages and things like that keeps up with the person, and vice versa. Some people are great, on a message, and hopeless in real life.
And like, if people are inclined to think this deeply about the book, the way that I was, and one of the reasons why it took 5 years, is like, there is an interesting criticism of how creative these days have to, and again, and I mean creative like artists in the broad sense, musicians, performers, writers, visual artists, whatever, you sort of have to engage with like the monster that is the internet. You have to like create a persona and then present that persona. But also I wanted to show that like people are doing that every day in their personal and professional relationships as well. That is not something that is like unique to the freelance economy, like, or something. You know, they're just every single person who exists online in any way, shape, or form is doing a version or a degree of that every single day. And that is fascinating to me.
Yeah, a little bit of a product themselves. Before we move to questions from the audience, the other thing I just wanted to explore, I think one of the ways that you really draw a distinction between Lally and Pat as characters and the relative kind of inexperience of Pat compared to Lally is Pat's family life is quite troubled. Lally's family, although kind of smaller, like her mum is clearly very successful in her own right, albeit having to have worked very hard and, you know, has her own backstory. She's got a best friend, Jen, who's very kind of put together and straightforward and tells it like it is to her as well. But, you know, I wondered how much of that, I don't know, it just seemed to me that really reinforces why she's confident and why she felt comfortable taking the risk to open her own gallery and really backed herself. Came through as kind of part of her character development, but you also kind of explore that she has made this choice. She's put a lot into her career. Her best friend now has a partner, but she doesn't. Her mum has found love in a very meaningful way in a partner that's very supportive of her, but Lally doesn't necessarily have any of that. And in some ways is quite resistant to it, doesn't want to give up her independence yet, is very much and very clearly kind of yearning for that kind of a connection. Yeah, can you just tell me a little bit more about those dynamics of Lally's family and friends in New York and the impact that they have on her and her decisions?
Yeah, I really, again, this was the shaping of these characters. So Lally basically has gotten herself into a life situation where she's only got one really good, meaningful kind of close friend, and she's got a pretty good relationship with her mother. But again, the decision to have those two supporting characters be quite, I hope, real and present in Lally's life, again, is just informed by what I like reading and what I was frustrated reading. And I feel like so often I read contemporary fiction in which protagonists are like kind of don't really have parents, or like parents who aren't really there, or protagonists that don't, especially young women protagonists who don't have any like meaningful friendships with other women. And I just find that really unbelievable. Or, you know, sometimes it's believable, but it's not particularly compelling. I think when, presumably at all stages of your life, but in particular in your like late 20s and early 30s, when you are coming to terms with what adulthood means and what kind of significant life choices you're going to make, whether or not you still have both parents or like a blended family or whatever, you are constantly thinking about like how, when you're making decisions about what kind of adult you want to be and what kind of life you want to have, you're thinking about your parents and what they were doing at your age, or just even, I know for me and a lot of my peers who are women, like, am I a good daughter, or like, what will I do when my parents age, or like talking to your parents about where you're moving to, or what, like whatever. You can't, it is, even if you no longer have your parents or have a complicated relationship with your parents, often that will make them more present in your mind and in your decision making about what kind of human you want to be and what kind of life you want to live. And it's just not realistic to me that the same with friends. And it made it a challenge in the book, because the book essentially is two novels. It's both characters have their own whole lives and whole stories and trajectories, but it was really, really important to me that they both had different, like very individual types of friendships and very individual family dynamics. Especially at this sort of late 20s, early 30s kind of juncture in your life.
Yeah.
And the thing for Lally is that, as you mentioned, so Lally has basically, because she has put all of her eggs in her career basket and is so connected to her gallery and so committed to her professional life, she's only got this one real meaningful friend. And we see in the book as that one friend, Jen, gets a serious boyfriend sort of for the first time. And Lally is, realizing like, well, Jen has a person now, and that will change the dynamic of the relationship between the two of them, who until then had always been sort of thick as thieves, drop of the hat, could meet up with each other, whatever. And I wanted to have that component in there to be a bit, not necessarily cynical, but realistic about why Lally might be more inclined to take a chance on Pat, whereas she wouldn't have previously if her Jen person was just always there for her.
Yeah. So I'm going to go to some questions now from the audience. Just a reminder, if you've put a question in the chat, if you could drop it on over into the questions, that would be super helpful for me. Thank you so much. My first question is from Helen Polson, who asks, what has been the hardest thing about moving from nonfiction to fiction writing?
Thank you, Helen. Something in the drafting process that I learned the hard way, I don't think there would have been any other way to learn that lesson, was that with nonfiction, I really felt like over the years that I could trust the word count. And it's not to say that every single word I would write would be the word that got published, far from it. But, as an extra 10,000, an extra 10,000, extra 10,000, like as the word count of the project increased, I knew that I was approaching completion. With fiction, like you just cannot trust the word count at all.
Out there in the wilderness, where is this going?
Yes. The first sort of finished version of this manuscript was like 180,000 words, like double basically what eventually got published. So I had to overwrite it to that degree, because when you're writing fiction, you have to do your sort of research about the industry, about the location, about, whatever is taking place and the specific details. But also the drafting is the research. You have to overwrite or write huge backstories for all of these supporting characters in particular, so that when the reader at the end does get, 5% of what you have written, it feels very real. Otherwise, they're like these, I think as a reader, often you can sniff when a supporting cast are like just sort of puppets or marionettes put in place to help the author just push the protagonist's story forward. So that draft, that like bulk amount, both in time and word count of drafting that just has to be done, is critical. That's not like, that is the opposite of time wasting. Like that is a type of research that needs to be honored. That's, I would say, yeah, learnt that the hard way.
Yeah. The next question is from Lee Weavers, who asks, thinking across your writing, what is the nexus for you personally between art, class, and education?
Thank you, Lee. That's a pretty big question. Something I reflected on a lot in 2018 and 2019 that I think informed not so much like any specific characters in this novel, because the characters are not autobiographical, but the issues are issues that are really important to me, was like this kind of, it's not even irony, or this weird situation where writing about like the worst thing that was ever done to me, and writing Eggshell Skull, and how horrific that was, both the life experiences that the book documents, but then also writing that book and touring that book, and the advocacy that I did afterwards was just shattering, like everyday, devastating, awful. The irony that in doing that work and that work being successful, I now pretty much enjoy like artistic freedom and artistic independence via very like long for financial independence. Like that's like, it's not like, I don't know, what do you do with that? It's uncomfortable or kind of strange. I think it's a symptom of the way in which the Australian media landscape has this just kind of, it's this just open maw and never-ending hungry churn for trauma narratives, which I didn't know or didn't realize back in like 2018, but now with hindsight is very clear to me. And I, you know, when I started writing this book, I was Pat's age and living in an absolute shitbox. And all I wanted was a dog. And in Australia, you can't, the huge thing, obviously, you can't get a dog if you rent. And so there was just a whole collection of aspirations of this enmeshment of kind of a level of middle class comfort and like adulthood milestones that, and this kind of like a shitty version of an Australian dream that, and then like the horrificness of the housing market that like all messily clagged together. And when I started writing the book, I was Pat's age and had the kind of like precarity or scarcity that Pat had. And now that I'm touring it and talking about it in the 5+ years in between, I'm Lally's age and I have a mortgage on an apartment and I have a dog. And I have come on that journey in a way with those characters, even though like neither of them are me. So I don't know if that answered your question, but these are definitely things that I think about a lot and that I think you can tell I'm interested in my work.
There's a straightforward writing craft question here from Gemma Cregan, which says, how many drafts did you write and how long did it take you to do all of your research?
Well, the first version, I subscribe to Anne Lamott's shitty first draft approach. And that means the first version of this was about double what it ended up being, over 180,000 words. I reckon I spent about the first half of those 5 years. So 2 and a bit years on that like research drafting stage, and then 2.5 or so years on the editing stage. For me, editing is writing because I do a huge shitty first draft. And I could not tell you how many drafts, but countless. Like if I had to, like the number of times I would print it out to then go through it, what I call a comb through, like top to tail, another full edit, another full edit, another full edit, like at least 10. It's a book is a huge undertaking. Even now that I've done 3.5 of them, it's like, sorry to anyone who has gone through childbirth, but what I think every time I do it again is like, oh my God, this is like what people talk about where there's like some strategic thing that makes you like forget how painful it is so that you'll be willing to do it more than once. Like there's something where you like forget that the book will always need at least 2 or 3 more full edits than you would like it to. But that, yeah, say lovey.
I've got thanks from a couple of the people who asked questions there for your fabulous answers. And I've got a note from someone else, Helen, here, that she's just checked, I think from her local library, and there's 257 others in front of her for a loan of this book. So very clearly, just a reminder, it is out in all good bookshops and hopefully at a library near you. I did want to ask before we wrap up, you mentioned there about your novel Eggshell Skull, not a novel book, Eggshell Skull, and those kind of that very distressing personal experience. But at the moment, to diverge from the novel for just a second, there is obviously a huge national conversation happening at the moment around sexual assault and the law and women being able to tell their stories. And how much or how little have you weighed into that? Or is there anything now after, so long since publishing Eggshell Skull that you'd like to share with people in this moment that we find ourselves in now?
To be honest, I did. So Eggshell Skull came out in 2018. That was the year that the Me Too movement hit the mainstream in Australia. I had started writing that book years before Harvey Weinstein or anything, and it was very fortunate that it came out not only in the year but in the month that it did. That Eggshell Skull would have just been one woman's story if it came out a year earlier. But when it did come out, it was understood the way I intended it to be, as a one woman's story, as a like kind of narrative vessel to critique an industry and a nation. And what happened in the aftermath of that was that, you know, it gave me this platform, and then I did a lot of significant advocacy work, public facing advocacy and law reform advocacy in the years afterwards. But what started happening was I realized throughout 2019 in particular that I had become one of, not the only, certainly, but one of the kind of like go-to girls anytime someone got raped or indeed a woman got murdered. And I just realized that if I woke up and checked the news and there had been a new any degree of kind of high profile or highly covered case in the news, I knew that my phone would be ringing and my inbox would be full for the rest of the day, because people wanted like my hot take on the like rolling devastation. And I spent a lot of time, in particular in 2021 and afterwards, consistently saying no to a lot of those requests for a couple of different reasons. A, because I knew that I wanted my work to grow beyond that particular narrative. B, because it was extremely just triggering and constantly like sort of just traumatizing. And C, because I did them for a while, and then I realized that I was just contributing to the noise, and that often I was being asked to comment before we had substantive information about what informed any given kind of attack or you know, horrible situation. And I think this, again, I have a lot of cynicism now, frankly, for this kind of like trauma hungry, ravenous news cycle. And I don't think that the way we cover these issues always has the kind of care and nuance that would be actually helpful. I do obviously think it's a hugely good thing that that these issues are in the news every day, because it is like an ongoing national emergency. But for example, it seems that we are having, like, some things have progressed since 2018. I think consent law in particular, and just consent as an issue. When I started advocating on that issue, I was considered radical fringe left, like idiot, who didn't know what she was talking about. And now my types of views on consent are only left of center. Like that, well, the center has shifted on consent, and I have watched that happen in the last 5 or 6 years, and that's huge. It's amazing. But the undeniable statistics that we're looking at are that for whatever reason, so many more women are being killed this year, in particular by current or former partners, and we're still seeing year after year increased rates of people reporting sexual assaults. That doesn't, it's kind of impossible to know whether or not instances of sexual assault are increasing, but we know that reporting is increasing. But we also know that the police are not capable or inclined to adequately respond to that reporting. Like in many very material, undeniable ways, there has been no improvement in the last 5 to 6 years. And I don't think we need yet another think piece from an author to solve that problem. Like I'm just a bit, we have extraordinary people like Jess Hill, for example, who have actually done the hard yards and continue to do the research and advocacy. And we have known the material ways that we could make a difference here, for example, by properly funding frontline services that are already completely overstretched and overworked and under-resourced, and the government just still refuses to do that. So I deliberately say no still. I've had 2 requests in the last fortnight from 2 different media outlets to write about this, and Jess Hill has already said everything I would say, and I just don't I don't think people feeling good about reading and sharing yet another think piece that essentially would be me saying what I said 5 years ago is I don't know what to do. What can you keep doing when we have the data, we have like the best way forward, and we just don't do it.
Mm, mm. Thanks for that. Yeah, I just didn't want to let that that moment pass, acknowledging kind of, yeah, your contribution to starting a lot of those conversations with that book. And I guess I want to bring us back to the work as we wrap up. I've got a couple of questions and comments in the chat about the importance of creativity, I guess. And do we all need to become more creative? And I guess maybe a personal reflection from you on, it seems to me writing a novel is a very different creative experience from something where you really have to pay attention to, facts and figures. So I guess if you want to finish on your thoughts on why you're attracted to the arts and to the creative process as a vehicle in this novel for telling these stories, and how has it enriched your life personally?
I love this. I what I would say is that especially in the sort of 21st century, and anyone who's watching this broadcast either live or afterwards watching the recording, you're obviously someone who engages with content on the internet to some extent. We are all consuming more art than at any other time in human history, whether or not you think it's quote unquote like good art or whatever, like because of how image saturated our world is and how interconnected we all are, or almost every single day. Every day of our lives, there are thousands and thousands, an infinite number of things that we engage with that have been shaped in part or in whole by another human being's creativity. And it could be on a billboard, it could be on your social media feeds, it could be on your cereal box, whatever it is. We live in a creative world, and I think we do ourselves a disservice with the degree to which a lot of us outsource what creativity we do come into contact with to an invisible algorithm or a corporation. And something that I have gained a lot from recently, and since this book gave me the time and space to think more about creativity and art in all different, again, shapes and forms, is actually how much power I do have to choose what I want to essentially fertilize my creative garden with. Because frankly, like, shit in, shit out. Like, if you have a library card, there is a world at your fingertips of extraordinary creative products. And yet, there's a glut of really average, like, regurgitated creative products. So, like, try harder, push through that, find what you personally respond to, and don't let anyone else tell you differently. I think it's a great time to both create and consume anything creative.
Well, if I can personally add to that, just to finish up, I have really enjoyed Book Talk as a phenomenon, as like a prolific reader and someone who very much enjoys genre. That has been just a never-ending, here, try this one. Here's your niche interest. It's wonderful, as you said, to have so much access to so much creativity, but finding the good stuff that really speaks to you is always a challenge.
Ebony, I'm not on TikTok. Can you please make me Book Talk famous?
I will do my very best. I'm more of a consumer than a creator, let me say that. So I'm not sure how helpful I will be, but that's definitely where you want to be. The book is The Work. It is our May book for Australia's biggest book club. Thank you so much, Bri Lee, for joining us today. Thanks everyone who has joined us for your wonderful questions. I'm sorry, as always, that we can't get to everything, but it's really fantastic. And congratulations on your debut novel.
Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. I'm just like now scrolling through all of the lovely chat comments. Thank you all so much. And thank you, Ebony. See you again in another 3 years with what else
Hopefully.
for the next one.
Thanks so much. We'll see you next month for Australia's biggest book club with Joelle Gerges. And don't forget, if for any reason you want to send this to someone, the recording of today's event will go up on our website, hopefully later today. Thanks very much, Bri. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy our videos, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell button to get notified when we publish a new one. See you next time.